purpose of this presentation is to respond to common questions and feedback from the previously released Episode 5 Business Rescue and Turnaround presentation. To get the most value from this presentation, it is recommended that Episode 5 Business Rescue and Turnaround has been viewed or listened to. All content in this presentation is an introduction only and is not intended to replace comprehensive and specific advice. All viewers and listeners should complete their own research and investigations before taking any action based on this presentation. The opinions expressed throughout this presentation are those of the presenter, and while well researched and gained through decades of industry experience, they do not necessarily represent the opinions of FMS Support Services. Unless specifically mentioned, no assumptions should be made about the identity of any individuals, franchisees or franchisors referenced in this presentation. Welcome, this is Sean Butcher again from FMS Support Services. This is a quick Q&A session to cover some of the common questions received from the recent Episode 5 Business Rescue and Turnaround presentation. Some of these may be follow-up questions prompted by the previous full-length presentation, or perhaps things that I didn't explain quite so clearly. As always, it is beneficial to watch these presentations in a video format where possible, but this one may be a little less so than usual as it will be pretty brief and will mostly just be me rambling on. A massive thanks once again to everybody that has watched or listened on different platforms, and especially those who shared or left a like or a 5-star review, as that really helps. If you think you're going to get future value from these presentations, then please subscribe, as it will be very helpful, and there will be plenty more coming up as I get around to it. So anyway, let's kick it off with the first question. Is there overlap and repetition between the steps? For the sake of simplicity, the Business Rescue and Turnaround presentation was stepped out in 8 sequential steps, which are shown on the table on the screen for those watching in the video format. Like everything theoretical, the reality is not so clearly cut, but hopefully the table helps make it a little clearer. There is definitely some overlap and some thought processes that are repeated or elaborated on in greater detail as the steps progress and more information is gathered and more planning is undertaken. In the table on the screen, all 8 steps have been grouped into 3 broad categories. Now, the first 2 steps, doing your research and analysing and being brutally honest, are largely preliminary steps, research and initial analysis steps to decide if it's worth progressing to invest more thought, time and effort. Then steps 3 to 6, which was step 3, complete overview and breakdown of each individual component of the current situation, and step 4, which was develop a plan to address each component. Then step 5 was understand the financial and other resources required. And then step 6, which was critically evaluate your plan's chance of success. These are all about the details of developing a comprehensive plan to rescue and turn around a business. Then step 7 and 8, which is step 7 was be prepared to hit the ground running, and step 8, which was continually review and update your plan, are about the implementation stages. One of the points of confusion was that in step 2, which was about analysing and being brutally honest if it's worth progressing, as you are only at step 2, this is a fairly superficial kind of overview analysis based on what you have seen to that point and learned through your initial research phase. You are considering if it's worth proceeding to invest more time, effort, and potentially money into the next steps and some detailed planning. Essentially, based on what you have seen so far, can you potentially pull off a rescue and turnaround of the business you are looking at? Is it savable? Do you think you have the right skills and or team? Do you have something close to the amount of funds you will need to invest? Basically, are you in the ballpark or not? Then at step 3 and 4, you take a deep dive into what is specifically wrong and what needs to be done to fix it. At step 5, with your new information and the detail of every problem and the fixes required, you take a deep dive into whether you have the finances, the people, and the resources necessary to fulfill your detailed plan. So where something appears to be repeated, then it is about reflecting on key considerations as more substantial information becomes available. As for the overlap, yes, there is some overlap in the real world between different steps. However, if you want to keep the process simplistic, especially for beginners, then it can be beneficial to complete each step in order. However, naturally, you would generally be thinking about steps 3, 4, and 5, for example, as early as when you are doing your research at step 1. And so long as you are thorough in each step and don't start skipping over things altogether, I don't really see a problem with that. All right, next question. Is negative cash flow a sign of a business in need of rescuing or turning around? Now, that's a great question. With these presentations being predominantly aimed at the franchising sector, which for the most part, not always, but for the most part, generally has little problem with cash flow into the business unless they already have a profitability problem. I brushed over this pretty quickly. Put simply, most customers of most franchises pay at the time of purchase, and the franchisee then has the benefit of managing cash flow out with credit terms from most of its suppliers, meaning that the franchisee often has the cash inflow for items they are selling before they are even required to pay their suppliers for those items, which generally makes cash flow fairly easy to manage. However, I think that the Australian stats show that about 90% of businesses experience negative cash flow for at least 1 month per year, and around 20% have negative cash flow for 6 months or more each year. A lot of this is normal annual downturns or quiet periods and will be closely linked to decreased profitability during the same period and can be predicted and planned for, and in itself may not necessarily be a huge problem in cyclical or seasonal businesses, although it's a bit of a pain in the butt to manage. Now, where negative cash flow can create a serious problem and may not necessarily be predictable or linked to actual losses is in those businesses that offer credit terms to customers or are only paid after expensive products or projects are delivered, and especially those businesses that also operate on slim margins to begin with. And when customers start delaying payment on big invoices or accounts or on a large scale, this can be a very serious issue, especially if the business doesn't also have the option to delay payment to the same extent on its suppliers or creditors. Or God forbid, their large customers go bust and they don't get paid at all. But they still have to pay their suppliers and creditors. I believe this can be a big issue in the construction sector, for example, where a builder's customer will pay for a large construction project when it is completed to their satisfaction. But the builder must pay for all their equipment, materials, employees, subcontractors, etc., on a much shorter time frame and well before they get paid themselves. If the project blows out in terms of time frames or the customer pays slower, perhaps because they are disputing the quality of the build or demanding issues are fixed or government red tape and approvals create extensive delays to getting the project progressed in the first place or signed off, then the builder who is managing the project and stuck between the customer and the people they need to pay then can have a serious cash flow problem, even though technically they probably don't have a profitability problem. Also, another circumstance that I know affects the construction sector a fair bit is where there is a large time delay between when builders commit to a price for their customer. Say they commit to build your house for $400,000 based on the price of materials and labour at the current time, but there are extensive delays, possibly because of government approvals or maybe even a backlog of work, and by the time the project starts in, say, 6 to 12 months, the price of materials may have gone up 30%, which means they are now potentially building the house at a loss. And then add to this the cash flow problems we also just spoke about, and now you have a cash flow problem compounding a profitability problem all on the same project. Little wonder the construction sector has such a high rate of businesses failing in Australia. So, in answer to the original question, a negative cash flow can certainly create a rescue or turnaround situation if it is unexpected, substantial, and unable to be offset in some other way. Whereas if it is something cyclical or seasonal, then you can predict it and plan for it. Then it may not be such a concern, and in fact is a standard part of many industries, such as farming, for example, or holiday resorts that only flourish during certain seasons, whether that be a beach resort in summer or a ski resort in winter. These types of businesses will expect cash flow and probably profit to be way down at certain times of the year, and then far better in other times of the year. The solution for those businesses for whom cash flow can be a serious problem is definitely forecasting and projecting the cash flow situation carefully and with maximum thought at all times. It may also include short-term finance, putting serious effort into anticipating the future of price rises and delays, being as strict as possible on the credit terms offered to customers, often while also trying to stretch credit terms with their own suppliers and creditors. Also, trying to ensure a consistent pipeline of activity or projects in those businesses that go project to project, so that cash flow from one project or customer can offset the extended cash flow from the next project until such time as the cash flow from the next project starts coming in. Either way, in terms of rescuing or turning around a business in such a situation, the management of cash flow would obviously have been flagged as a serious issue in step 3, and then be given some detailed planning and thought in step 4 and 5. So the rescue and turnaround thought and planning process will still be the same. Okay, moving on to the next question. Does the plan need to be documented in great detail, or can it be simpler and/or in my head? Now, for me, this depends on who you are and what you're doing. I've traditionally had to put such reports together to get board approval or submit for the owner's approval, and then involve many people and large teams in implementing the fixes, which means any plan, and in particular those detailed steps 3 to 5, need to be clear and explained enough for everybody to follow, but also convincing enough that a plan will get approved. Now, if you're buying your own lawn mowing business and you will be the sole employee who implements everything, your plan can probably have a lot less detail, so long as you are clear on the specific details in your own mind. I'm sure there are many theorists out there who will say that the process and details should be the same for your own single-person lawn mowing business as for a 15,000 employee business with boards and shareholders, etc. But I think you have to weigh up the amount of time you invest into your planning and the detail of a physical report or business plan and the value you are going to get out of it. If it's for your eyes only, or a very small business, then I think you definitely need to have followed the process, but documenting in extensive detail may not be as important to persuade or guide others, so long as you know what you mean and it is sufficient to keep you on track. Okay, next question. How high up the priority list are vision, mission, and value statements? Well, to be honest, not really high up on my list. Now, for those who aren't aware, I'll give a brief crash course definition of these. Although anybody who has ever done a business degree at university would have had these already smashed into you. Firstly, the vision statement. Now, that is basically a long term vision, dream, or goal. For example, to be the number one laptop supplier in the world. And then, secondly, there's a mission statement. So, a mission statement is more about the here and now, the purpose for being, or what the organization actually does. For example, producing high quality laptops that meet our customers' needs, etc., etc., etc. And then, thirdly, there's a value statement. This is about core values of the organization and generally includes things like environmental sustainability, integrity, ethical sourcing of parts and manufacturing, customer focus, etc., etc. However, as I said, this is seldom extremely high on my priority list. But if you feel the business and, more importantly, the people working there are completely lost and struggling to find meaning or purpose in what they are doing, then this may be something identified during step 3, and then maybe having a mission, vision, and values statement may be a part of the fix applied to this issue in step 4. I guess I don't so much have a problem with these statements themselves. I've completed many for various companies. It is just that they are given way too much weight, in my opinion, particularly amongst the theorists of the world who become overly preoccupied with spending their life writing and revising these while the business fails around them. I say all of this having spent a lot of time as well working in supporting and certifying companies to ISO standards, and in particular ISO 9001, which is a best practice quality management standard that many companies will get certified to, particularly if they want to get contracts with government or other large companies. And for ISO 9001, it's largely expected that you will have these things in place, and most of the companies getting certified certainly do. They may be up on the wall or in the company induction presentation or whatever, and they are largely written so the organization will reflect well in the eyes of shareholders or the public, if the shareholders and public actually care, and potentially the employees as well, if the employees actually believe what's contained in them. Although they all end up sounding pretty much the same, perhaps because most businesses and organizations are striving for very similar things, or at the very least are going to say that they are. However, despite the massive focus many organizations put on these, and I have seen organizations take their executives on several day retreats just to revise these at a cost of many, many tens of thousands of dollars, the reality is that once they are created and put on the wall or on the company intranet or whatever, nobody seems to care much about them until the next time somebody decides it's crucial to review and revise these. In fact, it is seldom that I've asked people in these organizations what their vision, mission, and value statements are, that they have any idea what I'm talking about. Sometimes they might make a vague guess and usually get all three mixed up and possibly hit on a couple of key points somewhere in the mix. However, if you start asking people the questions in a bit of a different way, such as what's the purpose of the organization, or what the goal of their organization is, or what does the organization want to achieve, or what are the behaviors that the organization values and places emphasis on, or what values does the organization really value, you suddenly start finding that people have a pretty good idea what the organization is all about, even if they can't recite, remember, find, or even care about the vision, mission, and values statements. And that understanding largely comes not from those statements, but from the way the organization conducts itself daily and the things management are focused on. and the things that get rewarded and praised. As an example of this, I was speaking to some people from a franchise network I used to run the other day, and one of them said to me, Sean, when you were here, we used to really care about the franchisees and their profitability. Now we only care about the franchisor profitability. Now, that franchise network still has the same vision, mission, and value statements that it did when I was there. But it means nothing because the day to day conduct of the franchisor tells everybody what the real story is. Next question. How do you bring people along with such drastic changes? So, we are talking here about having to make often fairly dramatic changes that are necessary to rescue or turn around an organization that is failing badly. Me, personally, I make a point of listening to the team first, and in particular, gathering their ideas of what they believe needs to improve and if they have any ideas on how they think it can be done. It's amazing how many of the necessary ideas to rescue and turn around a business are already in the heads of the existing team, if only they were genuinely listened to and given a chance to talk. Sometimes they will require prompting, and most importantly, they will need to believe that you are genuinely interested in what they have to say, that you can be trusted with the information they provide, and that you will use that information wisely and acknowledge and appreciate their input. That way, once a plan is put together, the whole team will hopefully feel like they had input and are a contributor to the plan. There are also often key influences in any team, and it is worth making an extra effort to identify and get these people involved and on board with positive change early, as they will influence others and take some of the pressure off of you. However, as I think was discussed in the main episode about rescuing and turning around a business, in my experience, there are unfortunately almost always a percentage of people that will protest, resist, complain, and even sabotage to prevent things improving, as they feel it is a disrespect to them or their previous work if anything changes, which is one of the reasons I will always go out of my way to avoid criticizing the existing team, even if they are partly or entirely to blame for the current situation. And in my own head, I prefer to think of them as victims of circumstance. These more challenging team members can be encouraged and supported to participate. You can try and bring them along with explaining the reality of the current situation, which may have escaped them, and logical steps that need to be taken. But sadly, there are some people who will not be able to be brought around to the new ways of thinking necessary to rescue or save a business. And ultimately, these people need to go as soon as possible to give the rescue and turnaround plan, the existing team who do come on board with the plan, and the new team the best possible chance of success. There is without doubt an entire episode that can be done on how to bring a team along on a journey with you, but that's a few points to start with. And now the final question. Is it D.I.E for diversity, inclusion, and equity, or D.E.I for diversity, equity, and inclusion? Now, this question was in response to what was really a side comment about managers or business owners who focus on irrelevant KPIs and then think themselves high achievers when they achieve them, while their organizations fail around them. Traditionally, D.E.I stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and generally started off with good intentions of ensuring recruitment, promotion, and treatment of team members was fair and free from discrimination, whether intentional or inadvertent, which I think everybody can agree is a good thing, not just ethically, but for the health and morale of any business or organization. However, this then often evolved into what started being called positive or reverse discrimination in favor of those people who had certain characteristics that would have possibly seen them discriminated against if they were alive in bygone decades. Obviously, this reverse or positive discrimination was only positive for those benefiting from it, and not so positive for those with other characteristics who were now in effect being discriminated against. And this system, often also previously referred to as affirmative action, frequently evolved further into picking employees to fill quotas of positions from entry level right up to executive level, based on things like race, gender, religious or ethnic background, disability status, sexual preference, age, and potentially other categories that generally have absolutely nothing to do with the real requirements of the position or the organisation they work in. The end result being a team of people who are highly unlikely to be the best people for the positions because the organisation wasn't even looking for the best people. They were looking for irrelevant personal characteristics instead. Consequently, I very deliberately, in the previous presentation, called it D.I.E, Diversity, Inclusion and Equity, instead of the traditional acronym, which I'm not the first person to do. Because if you focus on this, then your organisation is highly likely to D.I.E, die. Now, naturally, the biggest place these D.I.E targets or quotas play out, in my experience, is in government, followed by not-for-profit organisations, which is often heavily government funded. And as I'm sure most people will be aware, in these types of organisations, efficiency and effectiveness is often not high on their priority list, as the taxpayer funds will inevitably keep flowing regardless, and they can fluff around as much as they like. It really doesn't matter if they have the best people for their positions or not, because there is little real pressure on them to perform and produce actual results in order to survive. Then after that, it is relatively common to find these D.I.E targets or quotas in the too big to fail corporates who can really get away with a lot in the way of fluffing around because they are too big to fail, in a hurry at least. However, when small and medium-sized businesses start thinking like this, it can and often does become terminal, because businesses of this size just cannot absorb the lack of efficiency and effectiveness that comes with hiring people based on personal characteristics that have nothing to do with the job. You simply must have the best possible people for the job. And if you don't, then it isn't just a problem because those individuals may be an issue, it also becomes a problem because it affects the entire workplace. Other members of the workplace team will quickly become disenchanted when they have to pick up the slack of certain individuals who can't perform and were given the position because of a personal characteristic instead of being the best person for the job. And nothing builds resentment faster than seeing people promoted because of their personal characteristics instead of their performance, especially when the other more competent and capable people are overlooked because they don't have the right personal characteristics. I once got passed over for an executive position because the company wanted an extra female in their executive team to keep up with its D.I.E or D.I quotas, and they told me that this was exactly the reason why I had been passed over, along with others, and tried to portray it as a good thing for females everywhere in the company. Unfortunately, they only had one possible female candidate to choose from, and she was definitely not even in the top 5 best people for the position. So anyway, I handed in my resignation and went elsewhere. Not surprisingly, she performed disastrously in the position, obviously not because of her gender, but just because she didn't have the runs on the board, or the experience, or the skills at that stage of her career to handle the position. 6 months later, the company was begging me to come over and fill the position so I could clean up the mess, which I did for substantially more money than I had originally expected. But just to be clear, I did not blame the person who had been promoted ahead of her time to fill an executive gender quota for even a single second. Of course she would take the position if she was offered it. The prestige, the extra money, etc., make it hard for anybody to say no. And she probably didn't even know what she didn't know. It was fully the company's fault for choosing to promote people based on gender rather than capability and results. Now, before anybody gets a lynch squad together, I am not saying that organizations shouldn't, in reality, be diverse, inclusive, and equitable. Naturally, any organization is going to perform at its best when it picks and gives consideration to people from the entirety of possibilities in the human race, regardless of their background, and then treats everybody fairly and equitably, so everybody in the organization will feel valued and an important part of the team. But this is naturally achieved when you simply focus on hiring the best people, because they will come in all different shapes and sizes and backgrounds, especially in a place like Australia, which is already very diverse to begin with and actively encourages people to be themselves and accepting of others, regardless of their personal characteristics or background. You simply don't need D.I.E targets, D.I.E quotas, or D.I.E anything else. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the questions for today. If you do have any further questions, please feel free to email us at info@fmssupportservices.com.au for a personalised, confidential, and definitely free response. Otherwise, if the option is available at the point of download, feel free to leave any comments or your questions in the comments section or on Facebook or LinkedIn, where you may have found this link, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you download your podcasts from. There are plenty more presentations coming up and other stuff for both franchisees and small business owners, as well as those on the franchisor side. If you have any suggestions or requests for topics, please let us know and we will add them to the growing list. If you found this useful, please leave us a positive review or a 5-star rating, as it will assist the algorithms in sharing this with other people that may find it useful. And if you know of anyone that may benefit directly, please feel free to share the link with them directly. Otherwise, we will be back again shortly with a full-length episode which will expand on the topic of rescue and turnaround, with a much more specific focus on franchisors next time. Thank you for listening. I will speak to you again soon.